Alright, so I just recently finished both Steven Universe Attack the Light and Steven Universe Save the Light. In fact, if I'm counting correctly in my head, which there's a very real chance that I'm not, this video will actually be done on the day that I finish my playthrough of Save the Light, or else the day after. So even though I'm making the video earlier than that, back when I actually finished the game rather than when you're seeing me finish it, it should go up at about the same time that you guys will be able to see my conclusion to my Save the Light playthrough. And yes, technically, I'm not doing a specific review of Attack the Light. I am going to talk a little bit about my feelings on Attack the Light in this video, but primarily I want to talk about Save the Light. Point is, I finished both games. I am planning to move on to Unleash the Light at some point, but I expect that I'll have enough to say about that one that I'll want to make an entire video about that too. But because I do have a lot of things to say about Save the Light in particular, I of course wanted to make this video first. That said, first, to get my thoughts on Attack the Light out of the way, the idea of the prism creature and all of its various abilities, its ability to create duplicates of itself, is very interesting, and I credit Attack the Light with that idea. I do have a couple of questions regarding the prism as a concept. Why is it not a gem? Like, I know that they kind of portray it as if its prism form, like, literally changes shape to become its larger light warrior form, but that doesn't really make sense. It needs something at its core in order to sustain its light form. That's why the gems have gems in the first place. So my best guess as to how the prism works is that the prism itself, or else some smaller thing that looks like the prism, of which the larger prism is a facsimile, exists at the core of the prism creature, and it just projects a light form around itself, and that the other smaller creatures are akin to hollow pearls, or the centipedal children, or something like that. If we assume that there is a gem-like core to the prism, then all of its other abilities are perfectly in line with things that we see other gems do. So why is it not a gem? Or is the prism a gem who, rather than being made to be a soldier like an amethyst, is made specifically to be a weapon wielded by other higher class gems? Like, it's not as if we haven't seen gems that were made to be objects before. There are living walls on Homeworld. Like, straight up, they're gems whose physical forms were designed to be in the shape of walls. That's their base state. So the concept of a gem made specifically to be a weapon and nothing else makes a certain amount of sense. And yet they treat the prism as if it's a completely different kind of entity. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. It places the prism in this nebulous space between gem and one of the crazy one-off pieces of technology that we saw early on in the series that are never mentioned again. Like the duplication wand, for example, which, now that I think about it, also had similar abilities to the prism. I just wish that it had been explained better, to the point that the distinction between whatever the prism is and a regular gem was more clear. But I like the concept of the prism overall, and like I said, I attribute that to Attack the Light, and Attack the Light was a lot of fun, but it didn't have a lot of substance to it. It's very much just an action game that's pretty quick and easy to play. I imagine it's probably easier to play on a mobile device than it was on the emulator on my computer, but still, it's pretty fun. But that's about all I can say about it. It has a neat concept, and it's pretty fun. Save the Light, though, on the other hand, felt like an episode of the show. I could imagine that somebody far more talented than myself could take the elements that don't really fit into the show that well out of Attack the Light and make an episode or two of the show out of its story. I mean, heck, if you keep all of the locations that the characters go to and even some of the backtracking they have to do, you could almost make a whole Steven bomb out of it, really. if you think about it. And they definitely do a lot of interesting things here with the core story of the game, expanding the lore of the Steven universe in a lot of interesting ways. I actually did a theory about this back before I had even played through the game, going off of what information I already knew about the story going in. As the lead up to the climactic final fight in Save the Light takes place in a second pyramid temple, which was located directly below the pyramid temple in which that infamous mural was seen. The pyramid temple in which the gems recovered a gem which looks suspiciously like the prism, which led me to believe, and I still think that this could possibly be true, it led me to believe that the concept of the prism, because the crew did work with the game developers on the story of these games, right? I think the concept of the prism was supposed to make it into the show, and they eventually dropped it, leaving it for this game developer to pick it up. And that's supported by the fact that when they enter the second pyramid, when the characters enter the second pyramid, we pan up to see a second mural, which seems to show the other half of the conflict depicted in that mural from Serious Steven, implying that that mural in Serious Steven depicts, whether it was intended to originally or whether it's retconned into depicting it now by the game, part of that conflict against Hessonite and the Prism. It's all very interesting, and now that I've actually played through the game, I intend to do a more complex breakdown, trying to decipher exactly what each segment of the mural might be trying to tell us. And to be clear, because the crew did work with the game developers on these games, the story on these games is Stage 2 canon, which means that these games, the stories of these games, are just as canon as the show, save any elements that the show directly contradicts. Like, the parts where Greg fights against light creatures using the music from his guitar, we just kind of have to shrug that off and say, that's a contrivance made for the sake of the game. That's not something that actually happened, right? But the rest of it, the core story itself, does fit pretty well into the canon of the show. There's no reason to believe that, since we never got a follow-up on that first mural, the two murals and the stories they tell can't fit together, right? So, like, I'm not going to go so far as to say that that old theory, which I'll try to remember to link to somewhere in this video, I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's confirmed, but it wasn't disproven either. Let's put it that way. And when it comes to Stage 2 canon stuff, I mean, the best you can really hope for is that it won't be disproven, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you guys could tell what I'm implying here, but I'm not going to say it outright. I'm more humble than that. All that said, though, I mentioned Hessonite, and I want to talk about her a little bit here, too. She was so interesting. She was so interesting, in fact, that I really wish we'd gotten more about her. In fact, I wish we'd gotten her in the show. Like, I know that Hessonite, at least this design for Hessonite, so therefore the specific line of gems that Hessonite and Save the Light represents, is canon to the show because we saw Centipedal herself draw one when she was telling Steven her backstory. Her commander was, in fact, a Hessonite and may have been the very Hessonite from these games, for all we know. Like, maybe it's confirmed one way or another if she is. Maybe Unleash the Light does something with that. I know a little bit about Unleash the Light, but not enough to know whether or not that's the case. But it is, at least as far as I know at this point in time, possible that she is technically canon to the show, but I wish she'd been in it because she's so interesting. But then again, there were a lot of interesting characters in the show that at the end of the day, the crew didn't have time to really do anything with. So, and this is going to sound like a dig on the show, and I guess it is a little bit, because I've made no secret of the fact that I wish a lot of characters who didn't get follow-ups had gotten follow-ups. But the fact that we don't learn enough about Hessonite and then she's just gone and we only ever see her again in other Stage 2 canon works feels a lot like how a lot of characters ended up being handled in the show, if you think about it. Because the game, especially at the very end there, set her up as someone who, like literally every other gem except possibly White Diamond, depending on what the actual origin of gems is, was a victim of the system that she found herself in. And while, yes, she did victimize others, she was still a real person who deserved a chance to heal. And then, from what I understand, the next time we see her, it's during the process of redeeming the Gempire. And she's just redeemed. We don't get to see it happen. I don't even think we get an explanation for how it happens. Again, I don't know a ton about Unleash the Light, but from what I understand, we don't even really get an explanation for how it happens. She's just redeemed. And yes, I get it. Her society changed, and she was a big enough person to change along with it. That does make sense, but still, she's interesting enough that I would have liked to have seen it happen. And I think that's why I ended up making the choice that I did at the end of the game. I chose for the Prism to go off with her, thinking that having lived with Steven and learned from Steven and been influenced by Steven, especially Steven, who, because the game takes place right before Wanted, was at a point in his life where he was very self-sacrificing. He was perhaps the most self-sacrificing we'd ever seen him. I surmised that the Prism would go off with Hessonite in an attempt to try to redeem her, the way that Steven redeemed it. Because just as Hessonite had always taught the Prism that it was nothing but a mindless weapon meant to obey the will of its master, who in Attack the Light was technically Steven, Hessonite was always told by her society that she was supposed to conquer, that she couldn't show weakness or else she had failed at her purpose. Like, yeah, you can look at her relationship with the Prism as almost an abusive parent-child relationship or an abusive romantic relationship where the people involved in it feel like they need each other but are just bad for each other. But I read it as an abused person perpetuating their abuse onto another person. And I don't like that the ending that I chose is the game's bad ending. And I know some of you guys are going to disagree with me on this, in part because the game straight up tells you to by making it the bad ending, which is why I don't like that games have bad endings to begin with, except in situations where, like, everybody dies or something. But Hessonite going off on her own and no one even reaching out and trying to help her after she has that emotional breakdown at the end of the game doesn't feel like a Steven Universe ending to me. Like, sure, there have been times when enemies to Steven and his friends have been kind of left by the wayside. We didn't get a follow-up for them. The Ruby Squad comes to mind in particular. But they ended their tenure on the show as villains with conviction in their role as villains. Hessonite had just had an emotional breakdown. She was questioning who she was, and Steven was right there. This is the same Steven who, when White Diamond started to question who she was, he stepped up to try to help her, and he didn't reach out. I think that the Prism, having learned from him all this time, would have stepped up in his place, and I don't entirely buy that he wouldn't have stepped up in the first place to begin with, if that makes sense. I just think it was a bad ending for a Steven Universe game, which I think is my biggest problem with Save the Light coming out of it. I think the ending was badly written. All of that said, though, it was still a really fun game, in spite of the fact that it was a buggy mess. Like, yes, it's designed to be played with a controller, and I wasn't playing it with a controller, so there were aspects of the game that would have been a lot easier for me if I'd been playing it with the right hardware. And I'm not going to count that against the game itself, right? But there were definitely problems with the game. The background music would just cut out sometimes for no reason. There are definitely times where I feel like it didn't telegraph well enough where you were supposed to go next. There were areas that drug on a little too much, that were a little too big to the point that they stopped being as fun and interesting as they could have been if they'd just been dialed back a little bit. And I thought the boss battles ranged from really, really boring to just broken and bad. Like, I think the biggest offender is the fight against Squaredot, who is a delightful character, and I liked seeing her even for the short period of time that we did. But in a game with so many characters, all of whom should be able to pull a relatively equal amount of weight on the team, there were only a few specific characters who could actually do anything against her that wasn't a direct result of her own mistakes. It made the fight very long and tedious. If you're going to design bosses like that, then every single character group has to have some option to fight back against them actively. And if you're not creative enough or you don't have time enough to build those sets of interactions into every possible group of characters when designing your game, then you shouldn't have all of those characters in your game. It's that simple. But then on the other hand, I beat, like, what was he called? What did I call him? Duke of Strawberries or something? The Strawberry Battlefield boss. I beat him without even realizing what his weakness was ahead of time. He was so easy to defeat using the methods that I had been using up to that point, the methods that the game had taught me to use up to that point, that I didn't even have to know what his weakness was. And Hessonite, while she was superficially difficult because she had that really neat one-hit kill technique that was telegraphed just well enough that you could barely defend against it, and because her defenses were high, when I came back with the most basic debuffing strategy, she was easy. It speaks to a lack of forethought into the balancing of the game. So while so much about it was cute, from the art style to the music to the fact that you get to walk around Beach City freely and actually experience the whole place, which is something that we didn't get to do in the show. We really only saw a couple of specific areas. Even though all of those things are very, very good, and I think make the game a neat set piece within the overarching mythos of Steven Universe, I'm not sure I would call it a good game. I think it's actually a pretty mediocre game if we're talking about it just in terms of its gameplay. And again, I do actually feel that the ending of the game is poorly written. That said, combat was fun overall. Just the regular fights against regular groups of enemies with a few infuriating examples found amongst the enemy types was fun. A lot of fun. I liked it a lot. I liked the way the characters' abilities interacted with each other in those scenarios. And there is a lot of lore here, a lot of stuff that does build upon the mythos as it already exists in the show. So if you're a Steven Universe fan and you have the ability to play this game, either one of these games, Attack the Light or Save the Light, I definitely recommend them. Like, yeah, I don't like the ending of the game, but I understand why it needed to be the way that it was. One way or another, Hessonite needed to yeet herself back into space because she wasn't there during Wanted. She needed to be long gone by the time that rolled around, and that happens pretty much immediately after this game takes place. So while I feel that it could certainly be better, I still think it's a worthwhile experience for a Steven Universe fan to have. Even watching my playthrough, I don't feel does it 100% justice. End of the day, though, that's really all I have to say about it. At this point, I'm hoping that Unleash the Light adds enough to the story, the overarching story of these games, that I'll have more to say about themes and stuff once I've played through that as well. But as of right now, this feels like a story that's very much unfinished, because it is. But it's a story that I did, for the most part, really enjoy, and again, I think that you guys would enjoy it too. So, as per usual, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of Steven Universe Save the Light, and Attack the Light as well? You can talk about Attack the Light, obviously. I just don't feel like there's as much to talk about Attack the Light. Anyway, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. And of course, be sure to tell me how wrong I am about the ending. I'm serious. I'm trying to learn to take criticism better. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later. Hey Hey guys, that book I've been talking about forever is actually finally available for purchase right now. For Kindle, Kindle Unlimited, or as a print-to-order paperback. If you've been looking for an excuse to help out the channel, then check out the first 2 links in the description down below to get your own copy.